Oh, press star 1 to start the, or you can just hit start broadcast.
Hello, everyone. Just wanted to apologize for starting a few minutes late here. We ran into a technical difficulty about the maximum number of attendees we could have. So we are doing everything we can to make sure that this session is being recorded and we can get the information out to everyone. So we'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled The Regulation of ABA Practitioners, hosted by the New Jersey Association for Behavior Analysis and presented by Dr. Gina Green, CEO of the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts. I'm Suzanne Buchanan, Government Affairs Chair for NJABA and the Executive Director for Autism New Jersey. And I'm joined by my colleague Eric Eberman, the Public Policy Director for Autism New Jersey. The NJABA board has been monitoring the regulation of the practice for more than 10 years. During this time, Dr. Green has been an invaluable resource of expertise, caution, and motivation at all the right times. And we're thrilled that she's taking the time to be here with us today. Just two quick housekeeping notes before we begin the presentation. Number one is CEUs. NJABA is not set up to verify attendance for this webinar, so we are not offering type 2 CEs. However, you may wish to look into type 3 CEUs on the BACB's website because this webinar may qualify. The second item is taking your questions. We know that this information is pretty new for a lot of you and that it might engender a lot of questions. So to ensure that we can save your questions and reply to each one, please email us at a new email address. You can get ready to write it down, governmentaffairs@njaba.org. Again, that's governmentaffairs@njaba.org. So while you can still use the question box within the webinar, if you do so, we cannot guarantee that we will be able to answer or save your questions. So again, please email us at governmentaffairs@njaba.org. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gina Green.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the generous and gracious introduction and for giving me this opportunity to talk with your audience about this very important topic. As you mentioned, it is a new thing for us in our young profession to at least experience government regulation of our practice. So I'm going to just say a few words about the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts to start, and then provide you with a kind of broad overview of professional regulation, some of the pressures towards more regulation of our practice that have arisen in the last few years, the most common forms of professional regulation, and then I'm going to focus the rest of the presentation, the bulk of it, on licensure, use that as a proxy for all forms of government regulation. Say a little bit about what licensure will do or may do and what it likely will not do for practitioners, consumers, funders, employees, employers, and others. Discuss some of the risks and limitations of pursuing licensure for behavior analysts, give you APBA's position and model for licensure and the reasons for it. And then I'm going to run through just a quick summary of the current laws to regulate behavior analysts around the US, tell you a little bit about some of the things that come up when a licensure bill is being considered by a legislature or some other governmental structures, and then end with a few recommendations. So APBA, in case you don't know, is a nonprofit organization that's focused on the practice of applied behavior analysis, and in particular, advocating for public policies. This is an organization that was formed almost 10 years ago now, actually. We went public. And we formed the organization because the practice side of our field was growing so rapidly, becoming so complex, and there was so much work that needed to be done, particularly in the public policy arena, that wasn't being done. We founders of the organization felt that we had some experience and knowledge that we could bring to that. We have worked on licensure laws and the rules for implementing licensure laws now in at least 25 US states. We're working on licensure or some other forms of regulation in some Canadian provinces and a couple of other countries. We work on Medicaid rules around coverage for ABA services, and also the autism insurance laws and many things related to those. We have memberships for people in various categories, so behavior analysts, but also people in other professions and fields, as well as consumers, students, and registered behavior technicians. We have affiliates, which are behavior analysis organizations and other scholarly scientific organizations. NJABA is an affiliate of APBA. And we're coming up on our 8th annual convention, which will be next month in St. Louis. We have a program that is really customized to interests and needs of practitioners, trainers of practitioners, applied researchers. We try to provide a high quality program covering some areas that you probably didn't get covered in your graduate training, and that you may not find at other conferences and other venues. So we'd love to see you all there at the convention. The information can be found on our website. So in the last decade, as many of you know, there have been increasing pressures for regulation of the practice of applied behavior analysis. Some of the big factors that account for those pressures and sources of those pressures are simply the growth in the practice side and the demand for applied behavior analysis services that have come from consumers mainly. There have also been elements within our field that have advocated for governmental regulation for some time. Some of our licensure laws, though certainly not all of them, have arisen when a legislature was considering a law to require certain private health insurance plans to cover applied behavior analysis services. And as you can probably understand, the state legislature said, well, if we're going to be requiring funders operating in our state to pay these folks, we want to have some kind of direct regulation of them and their practice. And then we have other professions that, again, I think seeing these laws that were making funding available, newly available for ABA services, said, gosh, we've been licensed or regulated for years, and so those behavior analysts ought to be regulated as well. In the sort of general position that APBA takes, and based on years of study and experience now, is that consumers and funders, governments, really all stakeholders are best protected when there are clear, uniform, objective standards for obtaining and maintaining credentials to practice any profession. And those standards need to be legally defensible, meaning that whichever entity is issuing the credential, if it is challenged legally for denying a credential to someone, or it issues a credential to someone who then does something wrong, the issuing body needs to be able to defend its criteria, its standards in court if need be. We also, of course, prefer to see the practice regulated by knowledgeable members of the profession as well as consumers. And that's just consistent with the way professional regulation is done. The practice of medicine is regulated mainly by physicians. The practice of law is regulated mainly by lawyers, and so on. Of course, there are other people involved, but I will expand on this as we get into more details about licensure. So just for background on the most common forms of regulation, really the two most common are certification and licensure. So I'll start with certification since I expect many of you are familiar with it, at least to some extent. Certification is typically managed by an independent nonprofit organization. As you know, in our field, that is the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Certification is usually voluntary. That is, there's nothing that mandates any of us to obtain BACB certification unless there is a law that requires that we do so. Importantly, the requirements for attaining professional certifications come from the profession. And I'll talk a little bit more about exactly how that's done in a minute. Certification's typically portable across geographic boundaries. So if you are a BCBA in New Jersey, you're a BCBA here in California, where I am, in Timbuktu, or wherever. Licensure, on the other hand, is not voluntary. It is mandated. That is, there is a law adopted in each jurisdiction, such as a state, that says in order to practice this profession, you must hold a license issued by the jurisdiction, by the government. And therefore, the requirements for obtaining licensure and oversight of the practice of people who hold the license is exercised by, to some extent, the legislature, but more typically some agency or body within state government, such as the licensing board. Because licensure is state by state, because a law has to be adopted in each and every state or other jurisdiction, that portability that we enjoy with certification isn't guaranteed. That is, if you get licensed in one state, you move to another state that also has licensure for behavior analysts, you may or may not readily qualify for licensure in the new state. This is something that all professions struggle with, at least in the US, because of our system where licensure is done by states, not by the federal government. So there are several similarities between certification and licensure. Both of them have minimum eligibility requirements, typically a degree or degrees, specified coursework, and practical training. And then very importantly, for legal and other reasons, a common criterion is passage of an examination in the subject matter that is objective, that's been validated both psychometrically and legally, that's reliable, and again is legally defensible. There's actually a lot of case law around general standards for professional credentialing with examination standards clearly specified. With both certification and licensure, there is a requirement for the people who hold the credential to meet continuing education requirements, to practice within some code of ethics, code of conduct. And there is a body, an entity that will set the requirements, vet applicants to see if they're eligible, typically to sit for an examination. That body often administers the exam, although it's not the case necessarily with licensure boards. It may manage continuing education and set other standards for people who hold the credential. Just to point out some other comparisons between certification and licensure, there are certifying bodies that have some legal authority to enforce standards, but only with their certificates. So the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, as you know, enforces its compliance code and enforces some of its copyrights and so on, but it only can do that with respect to people who hold credentials issued by the BACB. In general, there are a few exceptions. They can impose sanctions on people who make false claims or use their the BACB's titles when they haven't actually been certified. But generally speaking, their authority is only over people who hold their credentials. Whereas government regulatory bodies, such as licensing boards, are mandated to regulate practice. That includes investigating complaints about licensed individuals who may be behaving incompetently or unethically or violating some provision of a licensure law. But also, the licensing board has authority over unlicensed individuals. It can sanction people who are saying that they're engaging in the practice and they don't hold the necessary credential. Government bodies like this typically have a variety of sanctions that they can impose on individuals who are found to have violated the licensure law or the rules that go along with it. They can range from reprimands to probation to requiring additional training and supervision to pulling the license, imposing fines, and even in some states, there are criminal penalties for violating licensure laws. Some other comparisons between certification and licensure that are important are these. In some professions, the license is the main credential, and a certification is a means of signifying competence in a specialty area. So as I'm sure many of you know, that's the case with medicine. People are licensed in medicine, and then they can be certified, board certified it's called, in various specialties. That's also true in psychology, where the state license is the main credential. There are some specialty certifications in psychology available through the American Board of Professional Psychology. In other professions, though, national or international certification is the main credential, and it often serves as the foundation for state licensure. That is, if you hold a national certification, that will be a qualification, often the main qualification for obtaining a state license. And that is true, not absolutely universally, but generally of speech language pathology, where there's a national certification issued by the American Speech Language Hearing Association. School psychology has a national certification. Occupational therapy does, and of course, so does behavior analysis. So it's that second model, that second item there that is crucial to the model of licensure that we advocate. There are some things that licensure may do. There are, of course, never any guarantees, but attaining state licensure is a way to protect a behavior analyst's right to practice. It may, if it's a good licensure law, allow behavior analysts to achieve some parity with other professions. That is, to be treated in the same way, to have the same requirements, to be able to access third-party payments and so on. And speaking of third-party payments, licensure may help behavior analysts qualify for certain third-party funding, but there's no guarantee. Licensure laws are not funding laws. They don't make funding available for people who hold the license. There are other laws and regulations that are involved there. Main argument for licensure, principal argument, is that it protects consumers. It provides consumers with a local regulatory body, something within their state, that again is required to see that everyone who purports to practice a profession has met standards, is licensed by the state, and is overseen by some entity within the state. There's some things that licensure typically doesn't do. It does not guarantee that people who are licensed are going to be competent or ethical. Virtually all licensure laws do require that licensees comply with conduct standards, and it imposes sanctions on people who are found to have violated those. but licensure by itself in any profession doesn't mean necessarily that a person is competent or ethical. And in most licensure laws, there are what are called exemptions or exceptions from licensure. Those enable or allow people in certain categories to use some applied behavior analysis methods, to practice applied behavior analysis in some form under very specific parameters. So typical exemptions in behavior analyst licensure laws are for other professionals who are credentialed, licensed, or perhaps certified, as long as applied behavior analysis is actually in their profession's scope of practice, which will be found in their licensure law, and behavior analysis is within the what's called scope of competence for each individual. That is, that they actually have training and competence in behavior analysis. We recommend exemptions for students and other trainees under supervision. You, of course, want them to be able to engage in some ABA activities without being licensed, but again, under appropriate supervision. Same for family members who are implementing aspects of ABA treatment plans under supervision of a professional. And of course, the paraprofessionals who in many of our agencies and programs are sort of the frontline people implementing certain ABA procedures with clients, again, under the direction of a professional behavior analyst. Licensure that we're talking about here is about individuals. So a law to license behavior analysts doesn't have a direct effect, will not directly regulate agencies that say they're providing ABA services. There are other laws that regulate those kinds of agencies, as I'm sure many of you know. There are some risks and some limitations of licensure. Probably the biggest category of risk falls here in that we're talking about legislation. And when you enter the legislative arena, it is unpredictable. You don't know what the outcomes necessarily will be. Any number of things can happen to a bill as it's being considered by the legislature. There are political variables and physical variables and others that come into play. Almost always when licensure of a new profession is proposed or there's change in the licensure of an existing profession, there are going to be opponents, members of other professions, perhaps consumers, perhaps some payers, who will oppose the licensure bill or will try to exert control over licensure. So unfortunately, always turf wars in this world of professional regulation. Licensure is a big deal for a state, and developing and operating a licensure program, particularly for a new profession, it can be costly. I'll talk about how costs can be minimized, but you will run into, in some states at certain times, legislators who are just reluctant to spend money. And so when we propose to license behavior analysts, they look at it and say, well, we can't really afford to set up a whole regulatory body for this fairly small group. And so we'll assign license to some existing licensing board. I'll talk about why that's something we prefer to avoid if possible. But there will be costs. You know, the state is going to be undertaking the cost of administering the licensure program. Most licensure programs that I'm familiar with are expected to be cost neutral. That is, they're expected to pay for themselves through the fees that they collect from applicants for licensure and renewals and so on. But, you know, nothing is free, so there are costs. A big issue, of course, is once you go into this realm of licensure, It means that there will be some kind of entity or body within the state that's going to ultimately determine who is going to be licensed, whether any non-licensed personnel, such as students or paraprofessionals, can deliver ABA services, and if so, under what circumstances. And this regulatory entity is going to determine to a large extent how behavior analysis is practiced. As I mentioned, the licensure requirements vary across jurisdictions in our country because it is state by state. And so that's just a kind of inherent risk. At APBA, our position on the regulation of behavior analysts that has been pretty much unchanged since about 2010 is that behavior analysts in each jurisdiction, each state, province, or country should carefully evaluate if government regulation is really necessary or if it's desirable, and then if so, how that regulation should look. There are various forms of regulation. Licensure, again, is the most typical one in the United States, but there are some alternatives. If there is a decision to pursue licensure, then we recommend that the licensure law or statute and the rules or regulations for implementing the statute are based on the BACB's Model Licensing Act, which has been updated by APBA. And I actually have to say that we are in the process of combining those two model acts into one and updating the whole thing, and it will ultimately be APBA's Model Act. We hope to have that out here within, well, I hope the next month or so. But the model of licensure that we advocate is that the main qualification for obtaining the government-issued credential, the license, is current certification by the BACB, and if you can get it, that the licensure law establishes a behavior analyst board, an independent behavior analyst regulatory board to oversee practice. That is the best way to ensure that the practice of behavior analysis is going to be regulated by behavior analysts rather than members of other professions or administrative folks. So the reason we recommend basing state licensure on the BACB credential, and in fact incorporating many BACB standards into licensure laws, are as follows. The requirements for attaining and maintaining BACB credentials have come from our profession. Over the 20 years of the BACB's existence, they have conducted multiple job analysis studies. They brought together multiple subject matter experts into panels to discuss the knowledge, skills, and abilities involved in practicing ABA. And then they have sent those extensive surveys that many of you may have responded to, where you're asked to rate the importance of every single knowledge, skill, or ability for BCBAs, BCABAs, and RBTs. Job analysis studies are a common mechanism that respected legitimate professions use to identify competencies and set requirements, in particular, the content of their professional examinations. The BACB programs are accredited by the National Commission on Certifying Agencies, which has rigorous overarching standards for credentialing programs that are grounded in case law and best practices in professional credentialing. The BACB requirements for obtaining the BCBA and BCABA certifications exactly parallel the requirements in most other professions. That is, you have to have a degree, you have to have verified to have completed specified coursework in behavior analysis, to have had supervised experiential training, and then importantly, if you meet those requirements, you have to pass a sound and legally validated professional examination in the subject matter to get the credential. So making BACB certification the main requirement for state licensure assures that the licensure requirements and the practice of behavior analysis are as similar as they can be across many jurisdictions, many states, provinces, and countries. It also simplifies the development of the licensure statute and the regulations, and assures we get the right kind of licensing board, that licensees are regulated by both the BACB, because it does enforce its compliance code with everyone at credentials, and also the state regulatory entity. So there are two layers of protection there for consumers of ABA services as well as professionals. Importantly, making BACB certification the main requirement for state licensure helps to keep the cost of operating a licensure program down, because, of course, everybody who applies for licensure will have already been vetted by the BACB to have the degree, the coursework, supervised experience, again, met those standards that have come from years of study with the field, and they will have already passed the only legally psychometrically validated professional exam in the subject matter. Also, the BACB has set up procedures where it coordinates with state regulatory bodies on disciplinary enforcement. And so that can help keep the cost of disciplinary procedures, investigations, and so on down for the state entity. So now, just to give you a rundown of the current laws to regulate behavior analysts, just to orient you to this table and the next ones that come up, I have listed in the left-hand column the abbreviation for the state. The next column indicates how behavior analysts are treated under that licensure law. Behavior analysts meaning people with master's or doctoral degrees. The next column, same thing with regard to the assistant behavior analyst, and then the technician. This column indicates whether under that licensure law, if you are currently certified by the BACB, will pretty readily qualify for licensure in that state. And then the final column indicates whether non-BACB certified people might qualify to be licensed in those states. An L in a column indicates that in the state listed there, that level of professional is licensed. A C means they are certified. That's certified by the state in addition to or separately from their BACB certification. And R means they are registered. And so you see the states listed here that all have, behavior analyst licensing boards. And they all license people at the master's and doctoral level. They all directly regulate the assistant behavior analyst. Some of them issue those folks a license. 3 states give them a certification. Notice that only a couple directly regulate the technicians by requiring all of them to be registered with a licensing board. And in virtually all of these states, BACB certificates qualify. There's some wording in laws and rules in some of the other states, in some of these states, that may allow non-BACB certificates to be licensed. I have question marks there for New York because New York is just an anomaly and has requirements that no other state has. It has a bureaucracy like no other state has. And so, and things tend to be changing there. So you can qualify for a BACB certificate in New York, but there are various other hoops you're going to have to jump through. One thing I want to add here is that as of January 1 of 2019, we will add Nevada to this list. Nevada has had licensure of behavior analysts under its psychology board since 2009. A law that was adopted this past year is going to move that from the psychology board to a behavior analyst licensing board, come 2019. In these states, licensure of behavior analysts is under psychology licensing boards. In 2 of the states with asterisks there, Missouri and Tennessee, there is a behavior analyst committee within the psychology board that has decision-making authority in terms of who gets licensed and how complaints against behavior analysts are investigated and so on. That is not common. Excuse me. Typically, the licensing board maintains authority to make decisions. And so in those other states, it is the psychology board that has all the decision-making power. And again, you can see that in all these states, behavior analysts are licensed. The only exception is Ohio. In Ohio, if you have a master's or doctorate, you are a BCBA, you get called a certified Ohio behavior analyst rather than a licensed behavior analyst. Again, most of them, but not all, directly regulate the assistant behavior analysts. None of them directly regulate technicians. And BACB certification is a qualification, principal qualification in all of them. Again, we'll be deleting Nevada from this list and putting it on the list of states with behavior analyst boards next year. In the 5 states listed here, licensure of behavior analyst is under various kinds of boards. In Kansas and Massachusetts, those are what I call omnibus boards. They regulate a whole bunch of different professions in mental health or allied health. In Maryland, licensure is under the Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists. In South Dakota, it's under the Social Work Licensing Board. And in Virginia, it's the Board of Medicine. And last but not least, there are states in which there actually is no licensing board. The licensure program is operated by a state agency, an administrative body, and it's typically called a direct license. You apply to that agency, and if you meet the requirements in the law, you'll be licensed. And you can see the alphabet soup of various agencies. They simply vary across states depending on the existing structures and overarching laws in those states. And again, some variation in how assistant behavior analysts and technicians are treated. Currently, Washington is the only state that is trying to directly regulate the technicians. In Texas, which is a brand new law, Vermont and Washington, there is a behavior analyst advisory committee within the state agency. They're advisory only. They don't have decision-making power. And Wisconsin is the only state where the law is a Title Act only, meaning the law simply says to call yourself a licensed behavior analyst in Wisconsin, you must have this license. All the other laws are both Title and Practice Acts. That is, they say you must have this license to practice behavior analysis unless you're in an exempt category, and to use a protected title such as licensed behavior analyst or licensed assistant behavior analyst. Just for your information, on our website, we have a tab in the top menu titled Laws and Regulations. And under that, there is a section on licensure regulation of ABA practitioners. There you will find and can download a table that summarizes the current licensure laws, and then a section where there are links to the regulatory bodies and to the behavior analysis organizations in states that currently have licensure laws or other form of regulation of ABA practitioners. To summarize, there are now those 29 states that have adopted laws to license behavior analysts. And as you could see, there are a variety of administrative homes and regulatory entities. 9 states have independent behavior analyst boards at present. 11 have behavior analyst licensure under another professions board. In most cases, that's psychology. As I mentioned, in one state, it's social work, another, it's counseling. The 2 states I mentioned, licensure is managed by an omnibus board, and in 7 states, there is no board. In a number of these states, the laws are new, and so the rules and regulations to implement them are just being developed or have not yet been finalized, and so licenses aren't even being issued in those states yet. The good news is that in all of these states, behavior analysts are licensed, or in the case of Ohio, as certified in Ohio as behavior analysts. That is, they're not licensed as social workers, even though they're under the social work board. They're not licensed as psychologists if licensure is in the psychology board. They're licensed as behavior analysts. And that's important because it means that state governments are recognizing that the practice of ABA is a distinct profession. BACB certification is a qualification, often the main qualification for the state license in most states. Now, in every state, there will typically be some additional requirements, such as passage of a background check, and often passage of what's called a jurisprudence exam, which is an examination on the laws of that state that pertain to the profession. Most of the laws I mentioned, because they're practice acts, they prohibit unlicensed people from practicing behavior analysis or representing themselves as behavior analysts, again, with a few exemptions. 7 states don't regulate the assistant behavior analyst, the bachelor's level folks, directly. I think that's a problem. We advocate for them to be regulated. They are practicing, and so it makes sense that they would be regulated along with the people who have advanced degrees. And in my view anyway, giving a license or some state credential to the assistant helps differentiate them from technicians. They do have considerably more training than technicians and other paraprofessionals do. They have other responsibilities they can undertake because of that additional training. They have passed a national exam. But for various reasons in several of the states where, again, other professions are controlling licensure, they have a problem with licensing assistant with bachelor's level people. In the states that have tried to directly regulate paraprofessionals, that is, that have required every single paraprofessional in the state who is delivering ABA services to be registered or certified by the state licensing board, that has proven to be very difficult. You can well imagine the numbers of people you're talking about there, the turnover. It adds greatly to the labor and the cost of operating the licensure program if the board insists on regulating those technicians. And so we recommend an exemption for them, provided that they're properly supervised. I have to say that in most of the states where licensure behavior analysts is under the control of other professions boards, there are many challenges. And there are challenges on both sides that pretty much come down to the understandable difficulty that some of these other professions have in that they're not behavior analysts and they don't understand the science or the practice, and yet they're trying to decide who can practice and how they should practice. And as I'm sure you're painfully aware, since you're so close to New York, in New York, the licensure law restricts the practice of licensees to people with autism and related disorders, and also requires exams other than the BACBs. That is an anomaly, not only in the licensure of behavior analysts, but in licensure in general, as far as I can tell. I've read hundreds of licensure laws, and it is almost unheard of for a licensure law to say that people are licensed to practice with any particular client population or in any particular settings. Physicians don't get licensed to practice diabetes or cancer. They get licensed to practice medicine. Psychologists aren't licensed to practice depression or schizophrenia or what have you. They're licensed to practice psychology. Their particular client population and procedures that each individual who is licensed can engage in is determined by their code of ethics and, again, their own competence and training. So in New York, it just had to do with politics and, again, with the existing structure in New York where professional licenses are all under the control of their Department of Education, that law came out that way. And that was despite massive efforts by NJABA and APBA and others. You may know that NJABA is actually currently working to get that restriction to autism removed from their licensure law. A lot of things happen when licensure is proposed. I mentioned it's a big deal for a state to license a new profession. And so, sometimes we've seen bills to license behavior analysts kind of appear out of nowhere. In some states, we still don't know to this day who was behind the initiation of a bill to license behavior analysts. There are always turf wars. There's always opposition from somebody to licensure proposals. But there's also support. And both the opposition and support can come from sources that may surprise you. I'm sure all of you behavior analysts are well aware of the many misconceptions there are about our science and our practice. Almost always, those just come to the fore when licensure is proposed. And so some of the opponents of licensure will be, dredging up arguments and misrepresentations and criticisms of behavior analysis that, we know have been around for decades and have been debunked, but they're going to come out. And related to that, we find that all of a sudden there are lots of people who claim that they're qualified in behavior analysis. Sometimes these are folks who have licenses in other professions, and they think because they had a class in behavior mod sometime, or maybe because of some on-the-job training, that they should be handed a license in behavior analysis without meeting the requirements that have been set by our profession. Now, they wouldn't allow us to practice their professions without meeting the standards that they've set, without obtaining a license in that profession and discipline. But again, there are turf wars, battles for money that drive these kinds of claims. A big issue that has come up when licensure has been proposed is that if the state requires people to meet standards in order to practice ABA, and there's still a relatively small number of us who would qualify for licensure, isn't that going to, because there aren't enough of them, restrict consumers' access to services? And so you get pressures to license people whose training in behavior analysis has not been verified, they're not BACB certified, they haven't demonstrated competence by exam, they may claim that they're qualified, they attest that they are, they may bring forth people to testify that they're a great behavior analyst. But again, that's just not the way licensure in most professions works. And I would argue that's not a real solution. We don't have enough physicians or nurses in many states to serve people who need their services. I don't think most of us would want to see people given a license to practice medicine who haven't met the standards set by that profession, haven't demonstrated competence, and so on. Same with nursing, same with other professions. Related to a point I made earlier, we do see, have seen in some states that when behavior analyst licensure is proposed, other professions may file their own competing bill. They may try to take control of regulation of behavior analysis. They may try to restrict the scope of practice or even claim that they own that scope of practice. So my general recommendations to you, as I urge all state behavior analysis organizations to do, is to help your state organization become more of this, the resource on behavior analysis in your state for legislators, for regulators, for consumers, the media, and others. I know NJABA has made great strides in that area, and I think that's wonderful. If you are not individually already familiar with the public policy and how important it is and what's involved in getting legislation passed to support and advance our science and practice, I'd urge you to get involved in that through the state organization and help NJABA monitor legislative and regulatory activity. There are bills and laws and rules being proposed and passed all the time that can affect ABA practitioners and consumers. We would really like to see every state behavior analysis organization have information and resources on the laws and regulations in the state available on the organization's website. If they're not there already. There's a lot of work still to be done in educating your members and also consumers about licensure and other policies like the autism insurance laws and Medicaid rules around funding for ABA services. And I hope you will all be actively involved in NJABA's evaluation of whether government regulation is desirable in your state, and if so, what that should look like. I know NJABA and also Autism New Jersey already have some great relationships with legislators and other state officials and consumer groups. Those are all extremely important when you're trying to get any kind of legislation passed. So continue to work on and build those. And if you do have any legislation that you propose or you oppose, it's going to be important to organize for grassroots advocacy, to help members understand how important it is to contact state legislators, give them templates for messaging, for emails and letters, show up at hearings, provide testimony. That is all going to be essential. The most important thing is to be unified. Legislators and regulators, in my experience, hate nothing more than division among groups. So if they're considering any kind of legislation affecting a professional group and they have one faction within that profession that's taking one position and another faction taking another position, typically those policymakers are going to say, you know what, we're not touching this. You guys go get your act together and come back when you have a unified position. So unity is extremely important. And also, my last word here will be that APBA is here to help. This is what we do. It's why APBA was formed. Not the only thing we do, but a major part of our activity is supporting state organizations and their allies in this public policy arena. So with that, I'm going to stop and take questions.
Gina, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, I have to pick up the headset there. So at the moment, we don't have any questions, but I think if we perhaps give it a few minutes, folks can feel comfortable putting questions here into the webinar format, or they can email us at governmentaffairs@njaba.org, and we'll see those as quickly as they can be sent here. Okay, here's one question. How do we prevent what happened in New York?
Work with us. Don't be New York. One of the things that I think we can help with is fending off opposition. Having worked on these licensure laws and the rules to implement them for close to a decade now, we've accumulated a lot of information about typical sources of opposition, the typical arguments that opponents will make, and we can help you counter that opposition, in fact, avoid it if at all possible. Now, having said that, every new bill seems to bring people out of the woodwork with sort of new arguments. And I can't guarantee that we could be 100% successful in helping you stave off opposition or attempts to change a licensure bill if you go that way. But we've been pretty successful. I mean, we wouldn't have 28 states with pretty good licensure laws if that were not the case. Again, New York, it was very complicated. It had to do with the restriction on autism had to do with the fact that is one of the licensure laws that was being considered at the same time as the autism insurance law in that state. And one of the, or more of the champions of the autism insurance bill just decided that if the licensure of behavior analysts didn't specify autism, somehow that would jeopardize implementation of the autism insurance law. And no amount of reasoning and data would dissuade him. There were also some other professional groups that were asserting that ABA only works with people with autism, that behavior analysts are only trained in autism. And again, NJABA, its excellent lobbyists, we at APBA, the BACB to the extent that it could with its restrictions on trying to influence legislation, we all presented facts and arguments and just were not able to overcome the forces that led to the restriction to autism. As far as the other aspects of New York, again, there's just a large bureaucracy that has a lot of power in regulation of all professions in New York. And again, try as we might, we, NJABA, APBA, have not been able to budge that bureaucracy on certain things, like their insistence that they have their own exams. Again, NJABA is working on this diligently. We're hoping to get at least some aspects of that licensure law amended. But I think a key is, while of course all of us who are trying to get behavior analyst licensure adopted need to have allies, and among our strongest allies almost always are consumer groups, and obviously a big and powerful constituency there are the autism advocacy organizations. So we love and appreciate their help, but we have to be careful not to tie the licensure law too closely to autism. So again, we appreciate and reinforce and graciously accept and gratefully accept the support of the autism consumer advocates, at the same time as we make sure we're constantly saying, this is a proposal to license behavior analysts, period. Not to license autism practitioners. The licensure bill will say nothing about funding or services for any client population. Need to be prepared to let people know about the other areas in which behavior analysis is proved effective. All the reasons in your state that you want behavior analysts, like members of other professions, to be able to practice their profession, period, with any client group in any sort of setting in which those licensees are competent and we have reasonable evidence that they can be effective.
Great, thank you. There are quite a few questions now, so we might have to move more quickly. Here's the next one. If this happens, will we be required to take another examination?
Not with the right kind of licensure law. This is one of the main reasons we strongly advocate for making BACB certification the main requirement for licensure. If you're BACB certified, you've already passed the only currently available legally psychometrically validated exam in behavior analysis. That's the sine qua non of licensure for most professions. In psychology, if you want to be licensed in psychology, you have to pass the one and only licensure exam in psychology, which is managed by the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. And that's true of many professions. So there is no reason for states to require people to take an exam, and there is no other exam. There simply isn't any other national exam that meets all of the requirements for licensure exams, which the BACB exam does. Again, you more than likely will have to take an exam and pass an exam on other laws in the state that affect the practice of behavior analysis, but that's true of virtually all licensure laws.
Okay. Thank you. Here's another question. If you lose your license for disciplinary reasons, do you also lose your BACB certification?
Yes.
Okay.
If they're taught, again, it depends on how the licensure law is written, but if the licensure law says to be licensed, you must be BACB certified in good standing, then that means that, you know, if you're sanctioned by the BACB, they're going to let the state licensing board know. If you're sanctioned by the state licensing board, they're going to let the BACB know.
Right. Okay. Here's one. On average, how long does it take to get a licensure law passed?
Oh, I cannot say. It's all over the map. In some states, because of certain variables, laws have gone through fairly quickly. Sometimes that's been because there's a very powerful politician who said, this is going to happen. Often those are politicians who had family members or friends with autism or other disorders who were benefiting from ABA services. In other states, it takes, you know, it's taken quite a bit longer. In some states, like California, we tried to get a licensure bill through and didn't succeed. It all depends on, you know, how long your legislative session is, what other things are on their agenda, what kind of support you have. Just too many factors. And you know, again, the range has been from weeks to years, honestly.
Okay. Here's a state-specific question. What about the state of Pennsylvania? I didn't see that on the list. I believe the psych board oversees behavior analysts and PA. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. Pennsylvania has a license called behavior specialist that really only pertains to people who want to be reimbursed under that state's autism insurance law. It is not a law to license behavior analysts across the board. No training in behavior analysis is required to get that license. And so, you know, no, it is not on our list. You won't see it on our website because it's not a behavior analyst licensure law. We tried to strengthen that bill when it was being considered, and again, because of various political forces, we're not successful.
Okay, great. Here's the next one. Would licensure affect other state departments, such as Department of Education's recognition of behavior analysts?
Not usually. Each of those systems, that's a very good question. Each of those systems has its own laws and rules and regulations. And my experience has been that they are not required to comply with licensure laws. That's true of Medicaid programs, it's true of education systems, mental health systems. So our recommendation to behavior analysts in each state is get the best licensure law you can, get that implemented well for a few years, and then approach the other agencies and systems in your state about adding your license to the part of their state law or rules that list the credentials that they recognize for certain positions or funding streams. So we suggest once you get your own licensure, that you be cultivating relationships with administrators in those other agencies. But it's hard enough to get a licensure bill through, so we don't want to be tackling too many battles at once. But yeah, those systems they just have their own sets of laws and rules.
Okay. Switching state departments here, where do you see insurance reimbursement changing as licensure becomes more standardized?
I don't know that licensure per se is going to have a huge effect on insurance reimbursement. Again, because there are many variables. Some of you may know that we have been working with other groups on the CPT codes, health insurance billing codes for applied behavior analysis services for several years now. And I think those codes are, and how they are valued, which we'll know by next year, will be a big determiner of reimbursement rates. I do find that third-party payers generally are more comfortable reimbursing people who are licensed, although certainly, plenty of health plans have been perfectly comfortable with the BACB certification because they know the strengths of that credentialing program. And so in states that don't license behavior analysts, virtually all of them that have autism insurance laws, for example, will reimburse BCBAs in lieu of state licensure. Same with Medicaid programs. So licensure may help, but I don't think it's going to make an enormous difference with health insurance reimbursement.
Okay. Now looking to people who may live or work in two different states. I'm a BCBA LBA living on the border of New York and New Jersey. If legislation passes in New Jersey, would I be able to be licensed in New York and also in New Jersey? Again,
that will depend on the New Jersey law, what it says about requirements. We always recommend a provision in the law for reciprocity, that is to allow people who are licensed in another state that has similar requirements to pretty readily get licensed in the additional state. And generally that's working. Again, that's one of the reasons we want BACB certification to be the main requirement. That facilitates that portability of licenses across states. But it all depends on what's in the licensure law and the rules for implementing that law in each state.
Okay, here's the next question. Does it benefit us or hurt us to pair ourselves with an organization that primarily focuses on a particular group of individuals with disabilities?
I don't know of any behavior analyst licensure law that has succeeded, that has been adopted without the support of autism consumer groups and advocates. And as I said, it's a balance. We want and need that support. You want to also try to get support from other consumer groups. As I'm sure many of you know, autism parents are among the most activist of all the disability groups that I'm familiar with. But if you have a state organization for, say, Down syndrome or traumatic brain injury, you want to try to get their support as well. Again, being careful not to be linked too closely to any one client group is essential. But at the same time, you need and should accept and reinforce the support that's offered from autism consumer groups and advocates in your state.
Okay, and we have a few questions coming in, understandably, about the current status of pursuing licensure here in New Jersey. So, Gina, would you like to speak to that in a general way, or some of the concerns along the way about how much information is shared and with what groups and the role of the NJABA board? I'm happy to jump in if you'd like.
Well, I'll just say that, because legislation, public policy in general, can be such a minefield. Things are very sensitive. We generally recommend to state organizations that in their initial planning, about pursuing something like a licensure bill, that there be a small group that works on that. You want to be careful about putting information out prematurely. Rumors get started, particularly with social media, get people jumping to all kinds of conclusions who don't have the facts. There isn't even a bill yet, and people will be speculating or making assumptions about it. You don't want to tip off the potential opponents to your bill too far ahead of time. If a bill is filed, of course, that's going to be public information. So, you'll get that opposition soon enough, but, you just want to be really well prepared for that. So our advice is for the leadership of the state organization to do the groundwork, the homework, the evaluation, educate members about regulation in general through things like this webinar. And then once you're ready to go, the state organization should take the lead on educating members about a specific bill, if there is one, and again, do that grassroots work to get people to be prepared to message their legislators and come to hearings and that sort of thing.
So I think, as you can see from Gina's response, there's a lot of homework to be done, and we're working on various aspects of that. We also have a few questions coming in about how people can learn more and get involved. So I would encourage any of your colleagues who may not have been able to attend the webinar to contact Eric Eberman, Autism New Jersey's Public Policy Director, or myself, Suzanne Buchanan, as the NJABA Government Affairs Chair. You can also contact any NJABA board member if you'd like, but chances are if it's related to this topic, they'll refer you to me. And of course, Gina is always an amazing resource. But in honor of her time and her schedule, again, any New Jersey questions, we'd prefer to have the opportunity to field them first here within our state borders, and then collectively grab the questions that we need Gina's expertise for. So there is, we're just seeing if there are any more questions coming in. I guess we might be wrapping up in just a moment. This last one might be a good way to wrap up here. Are there, and this is probably just a summary of things you've already said, but are there any potential risks or benefits of pursuing licensure?
I went through the main risks and benefits. I think the one thing I probably didn't mention specifically but may have implied is that for behavior analysts, where we are at this juncture in our field, we're a young profession, we're just trying to attain recognition, all the more reason for us to do licensure very carefully. But I think a risk that maybe wasn't so prevalent a few years ago is that if behavior analysts who do determine that licensure is a good thing or necessary thing in their state, if they don't spearhead that effort, then there is the chance that some other group, another profession, a legislator, somebody else is going to file a bill to license behavior analysts that will be bad for behavior analysts and for consumers. And then you'll be on the defensive. You'll be having to oppose that piece of legislation instead of supporting your own licensure bill. And so that's, I think there's a substantial risk. It's not huge. I mean, we've seen this happen in a few states where Other groups have filed bills to license behavior analysts. So far, we've been able to fend those off, but again, the whole legislative process is so uncertain, you never know what's going to gain traction. So I think there are, benefits to getting a good licensure bill adopted in your state, and that it's one that you craft, you behavior analysts do, with our help, instead of someone else.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We can leave it open for another 10 seconds or so. We haven't seen any come in the last few minutes, but I think we covered a really broad range of topics here. As we mentioned, the session is being recorded, so even for those of you who are on, you can go back and listen to certain sections. I know this is a lot of new information for most of you, and we're happy to answer any and all questions, receive your comments, and get your input. We're also going to be scheduling some information sessions in April, and we also are lucky enough to have Dr. Green doing another webinar for us a week from Thursday, March 15th at the same time from 12 to 1:30, and we will connect with GoToWebinar to make sure everyone can join us. So please spread the word to your colleagues that we will have total availability for anybody who wants to join us for that one. So we don't see any other questions here, so no more questions. So once again, thank you, Gina. It's been an absolute pleasure. I always learn something new. I've heard you give this presentation quite a few times, but again, there's always something new going on across the country that you have your finger on the pulse of and are lending your expertise to. So we're very grateful for everything here. So.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I also learn something new almost every day in this. I say this has been like getting another doctorate because they didn't teach me this stuff in graduate school. But I really appreciate the opportunity. And yes, I'm always available for phone conferences and webinars and responding to emails and so on as you guys work through any kind of public policy issues in your state. Okay. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So hope everyone has a great week, and hopefully we'll see you back here next Thursday, the 15th at noon. Thank you. We're going to end the webinar now. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.